In the rolling hills of Tennessee, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridges like ghostly fingers, stands a weathered farmhouse that has witnessed unspeakable horrors. For over a century, this modest dwelling has been the epicenter of what many consider America's most documented supernatural terror. The year was 1817 when the Bell family first heard the scratching in the walls, the whispers in empty rooms, and felt the icy breath of something that should not exist. What began as minor disturbances would escalate into a reign of terror so severe that it would attract the attention of future presidents, drive a family to the brink of madness, and ultimately claim a life in the most sinister way imaginable. The Bell Witch, as it came to be known, represents more than just another ghost story whispered around campfires. This entity demonstrated an intelligence, a malevolence, and a persistence that defied every attempt at explanation or exorcism. It spoke with multiple voices, predicted future events with chilling accuracy, and displayed an intimate knowledge of the Bell family's darkest secrets. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with each passing day until it achieved what no other documented supernatural case has accomplished: the apparent murder of its primary target. The Bell family's ordeal began innocuously enough. John Bell, a prosperous farmer and respected member of the Red River community in Robertson County, Tennessee, had built what many considered an ideal life. His 328-acre farm produced abundant crops, his wife Lucy had borne him 9 children, and his reputation as an honest businessman was unquestioned throughout the region. The Bells attended the Red River Baptist Church regularly, participated in community affairs, and maintained friendships with some of the most influential families in Tennessee. By all accounts, they were living the American dream of the early 19th century. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and respectability, something was stirring. The first signs appeared in the late summer of 1817, when John Bell encountered a strange animal while inspecting his corn crop. The creature, which he would later describe as having the body of a dog but the head of a rabbit, sat motionless between the rows of corn, staring at him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. When Bell raised his rifle and fired, the animal vanished without a trace, leaving no blood, no body, and no evidence it had ever existed except for the farmer's increasingly troubled memory. That evening, the Bell family experienced their first taste of the terror that would consume their lives for the next 4 years. As they settled into their beds, mysterious knocking sounds began echoing through the house. The noises seemed to come from the walls themselves, starting as faint tapping but gradually increasing in intensity until they resembled the sound of heavy stones being hurled against the exterior of the home. John Bell, armed with a lantern and his rifle, searched the property multiple times but found no source for the disturbances. The phenomena escalated with terrifying speed. Within days, the knocking was accompanied by scratching sounds that seemed to move through the walls like some massive creature clawing its way through the wooden framework of the house. The Bell children, particularly young Betsy, began experiencing what they described as having their hair pulled by invisible hands. Bed covers were yanked away in the middle of the night, leaving the family exposed to the cold autumn air. Strange sounds filled their home, chains rattling, gulping noises, and a peculiar smacking sound that resembled lips moving but produced no words. What made these early manifestations Particularly unnerving was their apparent intelligence. The disturbances seemed to respond to the family's attempts to ignore them, growing more violent when dismissed and occasionally subsiding when acknowledged. John Bell, a pragmatic man who had never given credence to supernatural beliefs, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the natural world. His wife Lucy, deeply religious and equally skeptical of ghost stories, began to wonder if their family was being tested by forces beyond human comprehension. The entity's first attempt at communication came approximately 3 months after the initial manifestations. What began as indistinct whispers gradually evolved into a voice that could quote scripture with the precision of a trained theologian, sing hymns in perfect harmony with itself, using multiple vocal ranges simultaneously, and engage in conversations that demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bell family's private affairs. The voice initially claimed to be the spirit of someone who had been disturbed and sought only to find peace. But this benevolent facade quickly crumbled to reveal something far more sinister. As winter settled over the Tennessee countryside, the Bell Witch, as neighbors had begun calling the entity, revealed its true nature. It demonstrated a particular obsession with John Bell himself, whom it referred to as Old Jack in tones dripping with contempt and malice. The spirit claimed that Bell had cheated it in some unnamed transaction and vowed to torment him until justice was served. When pressed for details about this alleged transgression, the entity would only laugh, a sound so chilling that visitors to the Bell home would flee rather than hear it again. The witch's knowledge of personal information about the Bell family and their neighbors was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of its manifestations. It would recount private conversations that had taken place miles away, reveal secret romantic relationships, and expose financial dealings that had been kept confidential. This omniscience extended beyond the Bell property, as the entity seemed capable of observing events throughout Robertson County and beyond. It would announce the arrival of visitors before they came into view, describe activities occurring in distant towns, and even predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Local religious leaders, initially skeptical of the Bell family's claims, became believers after witnessing the phenomena firsthand. Reverend James Gunn of the Red River Baptist Church attempted to perform an exorcism, but was physically assaulted by invisible forces that left him with bruises and scratches. The entity mocked his prayers, completed biblical verses before he could finish them, and demonstrated a theological knowledge that surpassed that of trained ministers. When Reverend Gunn suggested that the family had somehow brought this affliction upon themselves through sin, the witch laughed and began recounting the preacher's own moral failings in explicit detail. The physical manifestations grew increasingly violent as the entity focused its attention on young Betsy Bell, John's daughter, who was approaching her 13th birthday. The girl would be found with her hair elaborately braided overnight, her clothing rearranged, and strange marks on her skin that resembled handprints. She complained of being pinched, slapped, and having pins stuck into her flesh by invisible hands. Most disturbing were the episodes where Betsy would fall into trances, during which she would speak in voices not her own and reveal information she could not possibly have known. The witch's treatment of Betsy revealed a complex and deeply troubling dynamic. While it tormented her physically, It also seemed to share a peculiar intimacy with the girl, singing her to sleep with lullabies and occasionally bringing her gifts of fruit and nuts that would appear mysteriously in her room. This bizarre relationship led some to speculate that Betsy herself was somehow responsible for the manifestations, a theory that gained credence when the phenomena seemed to intensify during periods of emotional stress in the girl's life. John Bell's health began to deteriorate as the supernatural attacks focused increasingly on him. He complained of a swelling in his mouth that made eating difficult, mysterious illnesses that would strike without warning, and a general weakness that seemed to sap his strength daily. The witch took credit for these ailments, claiming that it was slowly killing old Jack and would not rest until he was dead. Medical examinations revealed no physical cause for Bell's declining condition, leading doctors to conclude that his illness was either psychological or supernatural in nature. The entity's malevolence extended beyond the Bell family to anyone who attempted to help them. Neighbors who offered assistance found their own homes plagued by disturbances. A local doctor who tried to study the phenomena was reportedly lifted from his horse and carried through the air before being deposited in a nearby creek. Even skeptics who came to debunk the story often left as believers, their confidence shattered by experiences they could neither explain nor forget. Word of the Bell Witch spread throughout Tennessee and beyond, attracting visitors from across the country who came to witness the phenomena firsthand. Among these visitors was General Andrew Jackson, who would later become the 7th President of the United States. Jackson, a close friend of John Bell and a man not easily frightened, arrived with a party of investigators determined to solve the mystery. According to family accounts, Jackson's group experienced such terrifying encounters with the entity that they fled the property before dawn, with the future president allegedly declaring that he would rather face the British at New Orleans than spend another night in the Bell House. The witch seemed to delight in tormenting visitors, often focusing on their specific fears and weaknesses. It would whisper embarrassing secrets, predict personal misfortunes, and create such an atmosphere of dread that even the most hardened skeptics would beg to leave. These encounters were witnessed by dozens of credible individuals, including judges, ministers, doctors, and other prominent citizens whose testimonies would become part of the historical record. As 1820 approached, the entity announced that it would soon accomplish its primary objective, the death of John Bell. The farmer's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely leave his bed. His face was severely swollen, and he could consume only liquids. The witch would taunt him throughout the day and night, preventing him from sleeping and describing in graphic detail how his death would unfold. Lucy Bell and her children maintained constant vigils, but they were powerless to protect their patriarch from an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The supernatural torment had transformed the Bell household into a place of constant fear and exhaustion. The children, once vibrant and healthy, had become pale and nervous, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers. Lucy Bell, despite her strong faith, showed signs of the tremendous strain, her hair turning prematurely gray and her hands developing a tremor that would persist for the rest of her life. The family's social standing in the community, once unshakable, began to suffer as some neighbors whispered that the Bells must have committed some terrible sin to deserve such punishment. The entity's intelligence and cunning were perhaps most evident in how it manipulated the family's relationships and exploited their vulnerabilities. It would plant seeds of suspicion between family members, reveal private thoughts and conversations, and create an atmosphere of mistrust that threatened to tear the family apart from within. The witch seemed to understand human psychology with the precision of a master manipulator, knowing exactly which emotional buttons to push to achieve maximum psychological damage. Throughout this ordeal, the Bell family maintained detailed records of the supernatural events, creating what historians would later recognize as one of the most comprehensive documentations of paranormal activity in American history. These accounts, corroborated by numerous independent witnesses, provide a chilling glimpse into a phenomenon that defied rational explanation and challenged the very foundations of 19th century understanding of the natural world. The winter of 1820 brought the climax of the Bell family's supernatural ordeal, as the entity that had tormented them for over 3 years prepared to fulfill its dark promise. John Bell's condition had deteriorated beyond all hope of recovery, and the witch's attacks had become so vicious that the family feared for their lives. The morning of December 20th, 1820, dawned with an unnatural stillness in the Bell household. The usual cacophony of supernatural disturbances had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. John Bell, now gravely ill and confined to his bed, lay motionless as his family gathered around him. His face had taken on a waxy pallor, his breathing shallow and labored. The entity that had tormented them for over 3 years had finally achieved its ultimate goal. But the Bell Witch's work was far from finished. As John Bell drew his final breaths, the invisible presence made itself known one last time, its voice echoing through the cabin with triumphant malice. "I have accomplished my purpose," it declared, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. True to its word, John Bell died that very day, his body finally succumbing to the relentless supernatural assault that had consumed his health, his peace, and ultimately his life. The funeral of John Bell became a spectacle unlike any the community had ever witnessed. As mourners gathered to pay their respects, the Bell Witch made its presence felt throughout the ceremony. Witnesses reported hearing otherworldly singing emanating from the very air around the gravesite, a haunting melody that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. The voice was beautiful yet terrifying, its ethereal quality making seasoned frontiersmen weep while simultaneously filling them with an inexplicable dread. During the burial service, the entity's voice rose above the minister's prayers, reciting passages from Scripture with such perfect articulation that several attendees later claimed it knew the Bible better than any preacher they had ever heard. Yet there was something profoundly wrong with these recitations, as though the words themselves were being twisted into blasphemy by the very act of the witch speaking them. The minister himself struggled to continue his service, his voice faltering as the invisible presence seemed to challenge every word he spoke. Elizabeth Bell, now a young woman whose beauty had been marred by years of supernatural torment, stood at her father's graveside with hollow eyes that had seen too much. The entity had not forgotten its other primary target, Even as dirt was thrown upon John Bell's coffin, the witch's attention turned to her with renewed intensity. "Do not think this ends with his death," it whispered, its voice audible only to her. The weeks following John Bell's death brought no relief to the grieving family. If anything, the supernatural activity intensified, as though the entity had been energized by its victory. The witch's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, no longer content with mere physical torment. It began to display an intimate knowledge of each family member's deepest fears and most shameful secrets, using this information to inflict psychological wounds that cut far deeper than any physical assault. Lucy Bell, the matriarch who had somehow maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, found herself bearing the brunt of the entity's newfound cruelty. The witch would wake her at all hours of the night, forcing her to witness horrifying visions of her deceased husband's suffering. These nocturnal visitations were so vivid and disturbing that Lucy aged years in a matter of weeks, her once strong constitution crumbling under the relentless psychological assault. The entity's intelligence seemed to grow with each passing day, as though it were learning from its interactions with the family. It began to demonstrate knowledge of events occurring far beyond the Bell property, accurately predicting political developments, weather patterns, and even the personal affairs of neighbors living miles away. This omniscience made the witch an even more formidable adversary, as the family could never be certain what private moments or conversations the entity might have witnessed. Local authorities, who had initially dismissed the Bell family's claims as frontier superstition, found themselves confronted with evidence they could not ignore. Sheriff deputies sent to investigate the disturbances returned with accounts so disturbing that many refused to discuss them publicly. One deputy reported seeing furniture move of its own accord, while another claimed to have been physically assaulted by invisible hands that left actual bruises on his body. The witch's interactions with visitors became increasingly sophisticated and malevolent. It would greet guests by name before they had been introduced, often revealing embarrassing personal information that no one present could possibly have known. The entity seemed to take particular pleasure in exposing the secret sins and hidden shames of those who came to witness the phenomena, turning what should have been investigations into public humiliations. Dr. George Hobson, a physician who had treated John Bell during his final illness, became one of the entity's most frequent targets. The witch would mock his medical knowledge, correctly diagnosing ailments in other patients that the doctor had missed. It would describe surgical procedures in detail, despite the fact that such knowledge should have been impossible for a supernatural entity to possess. The psychological torment inflicted upon Dr. Hobson was so severe that he eventually refused to set foot on Bell property, claiming that the entity was undermining his very identity as a healer. Betsy Bell, now in her late teens, remained the focus of the witch's most persistent attention. The entity's obsession with her had evolved from mere torment into something far more sinister and possessive. It would speak to her in intimate whispers, describing a future where she would belong to it entirely. The witch claimed that her upcoming marriage to Joshua Gardner was an affront to their supernatural bond, threatening increasingly violent consequences if the engagement proceeded. The pressure on Betsy became unbearable as the entity's threats escalated. It began to appear to her in visual form, manifesting as a dark shadow that followed her everywhere she went. The witch's presence was so overwhelming that Betsy found herself unable to maintain normal relationships, as the entity would interfere with any conversation or social interaction she attempted. Friends and suitors alike were driven away by supernatural manifestations that seemed designed to isolate her completely. Joshua Gardner, the young man who had courageously proposed to Betsy despite the supernatural opposition, found himself the target of the witch's most vicious attacks. The entity would appear to him in his dreams, showing him horrifying visions of what would happen if he proceeded with the marriage. During the day, he would experience phantom pains and mysterious injuries that physicians could not explain. Tools would break in his hands, horses would refuse to obey him, and crops would wither in fields where he had worked. The witch's campaign against Joshua was relentless and methodical. It would whisper his deepest insecurities and fears, slowly eroding his confidence and self-worth. The entity seemed to understand that the most effective way to destroy the young man was not through physical violence, but through psychological warfare that would make him question his own sanity. Joshua began to experience episodes where he would lose time, finding himself in locations with no memory of how he had arrived there. Local ministers, who had initially offered spiritual guidance to the Bell family, found themselves powerless against the entity's supernatural abilities. The witch would interrupt prayer services with blasphemous commentary, causing Bibles to burst into flames and holy water to turn black. Several clergymen reported feeling physically ill in the presence of the entity, as though its very existence was an affront to divine order. The Reverend James Gunn, a respected Methodist minister who had known the Bell family for years, attempted to perform an exorcism at the family's request. The results were catastrophic. The witch's response was so violent that the Reverend was physically thrown from the house, his body covered in scratches and bruises that formed strange patterns on his skin. He later claimed that the entity had shown him visions of hell so vivid and terrifying that he never fully recovered from the experience. As news of the Bell Witch spread throughout Tennessee and beyond, the family found themselves at the center of a media sensation that brought both curious visitors and unwanted attention. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New Orleans traveled to Adams to document the phenomena, though many left with their notes mysteriously destroyed and their equipment damaged beyond repair. The witch seemed to understand the power of publicity and used it to its advantage, performing increasingly dramatic manifestations for audiences that spread its reputation far and wide. The entity's influence began to extend beyond the Bell property, affecting the broader community in ways that defied explanation. Livestock in neighboring farms would fall ill without cause, crops would fail despite favorable weather conditions, and residents would experience shared nightmares that featured the same terrifying imagery. The witch had become more than a family curse. It was transforming into a regional nightmare that threatened the very fabric of frontier society. By the spring of 1821, the Bell family had reached a breaking point. The constant supernatural assault had taken its toll on every member of the household, leaving them physically and emotionally exhausted. Lucy Bell, who had been the family's anchor throughout the ordeal, began to show signs of severe psychological distress. Her once unwavering faith had been shaken by the entity's apparent immunity to religious intervention, and she found herself questioning everything she had believed about the nature of good and evil. The witch's final phase of torment was perhaps its most cruel. Having achieved its primary goal of destroying John Bell, the entity now seemed determined to dismantle the entire family structure. It would pit family members against each other, revealing private conversations and sowing seeds of mistrust that threatened to tear apart the bonds that had held them together through years of supernatural terror. The witch understood that the family's unity was their greatest strength, and it systematically worked to destroy that foundation. In a desperate attempt to save his family from complete destruction, John Bell Jr. made the fateful decision that would finally bring the terror to an end. The young man, who had shown remarkable courage throughout the ordeal, confronted the entity directly, demanding that it leave his family in peace. The witch's response would set in motion the final chapter of the Bell Witch legend, a confrontation that would echo through the generations and establish the supernatural tale as one of America's most enduring mysteries. The stage was set for a supernatural showdown that would determine whether the Bell family would survive intact or be forever destroyed by the malevolent force that had haunted them for over 4 years. The confrontation between John Bell Jr. and the Bell Witch marked a turning point in this supernatural siege that had terrorized Adams, Tennessee for over 4 years. But what transpired in those final months wasn't just the end of a haunting. It was the beginning of something far more sinister, something that would transform the Bell family legacy from victims of supernatural torment into harbingers of a darkness that still echoes through the Tennessee hills today. John Bell Jr. possessed something his father had lacked. Where John Bell Sr. had cowered and pleaded, his son approached the entity with calculated determination. He'd spent months studying the witch's patterns, documenting its behaviors, searching for weaknesses in what seemed an invincible adversary. The younger Bell understood that this wasn't merely about ending the haunting. It was about survival, about preventing whatever had consumed his father from devouring what remained of his family. The showdown began on a bitter February night in 1821, 3 months after his father's funeral. John Jr. had prepared meticulously. He'd gathered objects the witch had previously manipulated, arranged them in the main cabin according to patterns he'd observed during its manifestations. His final illness. "I know what you are," John Jr. declared to the empty room, his voice steady despite the temperature dropping so rapidly his breath formed clouds. "You're not some restless spirit seeking justice. You're something else entirely." The response came not as the familiar cackling voice, but as a presence so oppressive that the cabin's wooden beams began groaning under invisible weight. Furniture lifted from the floor, suspended in midair as if gravity itself had been negotiated away. But John Jr. didn't flinch. He'd witnessed these theatrics for years. Tonight he demanded answers. "Show yourself," he commanded, raising the vial of his father's blood. "Not your parlor tricks, not your borrowed voices." What materialized in that cabin defied every account the Bell family had previously given. Witnesses to later events would describe it as a convergence of shadows that seemed to devour light itself, a form that shifted between human and something altogether more ancient. As consciousness, its words carrying the weight of centuries. You think you understand, it communicated, but you comprehend nothing. Your father's death was not my purpose, it was my payment. His carefully constructed courage wavered as the entity revealed the truth that would haunt his family for generations. The Bell Witch hadn't been drawn to their property by chance or summoned by some perceived injustice. It had been invited, bargained with, contracted by someone within the Bell family itself. Your grandmother, Martha Bell, called to me in 1804, the entity continued, when your father faced bankruptcy and ruin. She offered what I required, the eventual life force of her son, in exchange for 17 years of prosperity. Your family's wealth, your father's successful land acquisitions, your social standing in Adams County, his understanding of everything he'd believed about his family's history. Their prosperity hadn't been earned through hard work and good fortune. It had been bought through a supernatural contract that had slowly consumed his father from within. The Bell Witch hadn't been their tormentor, it had been their creditor, come to collect what was owed. But the entity wasn't finished. The contract included provisions, it explained. Should any Bell attempt to break our agreement or interfere with collection, the debt would transfer to them. John Jr. felt the weight of realization crushing down upon him. By challenging the entity, by demanding this confrontation, he'd triggered clauses in a supernatural contract signed before his birth. The blood in his hands, his father's blood, began to glow with an unnatural warmth. However, the entity continued, I am not without mercy. Your father's payment was substantial, but not complete. I offer you a choice, John Bell Jr. Accept the remainder of his debt, and your family's suffering ends with your life. The alternative it proposed was horrifying in its implications. His life as it had his father's, the entity offered to bind itself to the Bell bloodline permanently. Future generations would inherit not the victim's role, but the witch's power. They would become conduits for supernatural forces, capable of wielding the same abilities that had terrorized their family, but at a cost that would compound with each generation. Your descendants will possess gifts beyond mortal comprehension, it promised. They will see beyond the veil between worlds, command respect through fear, and accumulate wealth and influence that will make your current holdings that seem trivial. But they will also carry the hunger that drives me. John Jr. understood the implications. He could end the immediate threat to his family by sacrificing himself, or he could transform them into something that would perpetuate the very evil that had destroyed his father. The choice seemed impossible, yet the entity pressed for an immediate decision. In that moment, John Jr. made a decision that would echo through generations. He chose neither option presented. Instead, he proposed a third alternative, one that demonstrated either brilliant negotiation or tragic miscalculation. He offered to split the supernatural debt among all surviving Bell family members, diluting its power but ensuring its persistence. Bind yourself to our entire bloodline, he proposed, but limit your influence. Instead of consuming us completely, take only what you need to sustain yourself from each generation. The entity considered this proposal with what seemed like amusement. I would give them a choice I never had, John Jr. replied. Each generation can decide how much of your power to embrace and how much to resist. The agreement forged that night created what would become known among supernatural scholars as the Bell Covenant. Each Bell descendant would inherit a fraction of the witch's abilities: enhanced intuition, the capacity to influence others' thoughts, resistance to conventional harm, and an unnaturally extended lifespan. But they would also inherit its hungers: a need to periodically draw sustenance from others' emotional energy, an inability to form lasting relationships without eventually draining their partners, and a compulsion to seek positions of power over others. The transformation wasn't immediate. John Jr. appeared unchanged when his family found him the next morning, unconscious but alive in the cabin where furniture had been arranged in impossible configurations. The vial of his father's blood had vanished, and carved into the wooden floor was a symbol that none of them recognized, but all instinctively feared. The first signs of change manifested weeks later. John Jr. began experiencing vivid dreams of events occurring miles away, dreams that proved unnaturally accurate. His ability to read people's intentions became so pronounced that neighbors found conversations with him deeply unsettling. Most disturbing, he discovered he could influence others' decisions through sustained eye contact and carefully modulated speech patterns. His siblings exhibited similar developments, though each manifested different aspects of their inherited abilities. Elizabeth, who had borne the brunt of the witch's physical attacks, found she could inflict pain on others through concentrated thought. Joel developed an ability to become nearly invisible when he chose, moving through crowds unnoticed despite his large frame. Richard discovered he could sense the location of valuable objects, making him unnaturally successful in land speculation and mining ventures. His death began flourishing in ways that defied economic logic. Their land holdings expanded exponentially. Their influence in Tennessee politics grew until Bell family members held positions in state government far beyond what their education or experience should have warranted. Most unnaturally, they seemed immune to the diseases and accidents that claimed their neighbors, leading to whispered speculation about supernatural protection. But prosperity came with a price that became more apparent with each passing year. The Bell siblings found themselves emotionally isolated, unable to maintain close relationships without gradually draining their friends and lovers of vitality. Their children, when they had them, were born with distinctive characteristics: unusually pale skin, eyes that reflected light strangely in darkness, and an uncanny ability to know things they shouldn't know. More troubling were the disappearances that began occurring around Bell properties. Travelers who stopped at Bell-owned inns sometimes vanished overnight, leaving behind only their belongings and horses. Workers employed on Bell farms occasionally failed to return home, with search parties finding no trace of their whereabouts. Local authorities, many of whom owed their positions to Bell family influence, rarely pursued these investigations with vigor. The entity that had once called itself the Bell Witch remained connected to the family, though its manifestations became more subtle. Rather than the dramatic poltergeist activity of the earlier years, it now worked through the Bell descendants themselves. When they felt threatened or challenged, furniture would rearrange itself around them. When they were angry, their opponents would suffer mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. When they hungered for the emotional energy that sustained their abilities, suitable victims would be drawn to them as if by magnetic attraction. By 1850, The Bell family had established what amounted to a supernatural dynasty in Tennessee. They owned vast tracts of land, controlled several banks and businesses, and had married into prominent political families across the South. Yet they remained fundamentally isolated from normal human society, bound together by shared secrets and shared hungers that they could discuss with no one outside their bloodline. The Civil War provided new opportunities for the Bell family to exercise their inherited abilities. They supplied both Union and Confederate forces, using their supernatural insights to predict battle outcomes and position themselves advantageously, regardless of which side prevailed. Family members served as spies and negotiators, their ability to influence others' thoughts, making them invaluable to military commanders who never quite understood why they trusted Bell family counsel so completely. But the war also revealed the full extent of what they had become. In battlefield hospitals run by Bell family members, wounded soldiers recovered at impossible rates, but many displayed personality changes afterward, becoming unusually devoted to their Bell physicians. Confederate units advised by Bell strategists showed remarkable cohesion and courage, though survivors reported strange dreams and an inability to clearly remember their Bell advisors' faces. Most disturbing were the accounts of Bell family members moving through battlefields after engagements, ostensibly searching for wounded soldiers to aid. However, witnesses described seeing them kneeling beside dying men, placing their hands on the soldiers' chests until the men's struggles ceased. Those soldiers who survived such encounters spoke of feeling as though something essential had been drawn from them, leaving them alive, but fundamentally changed. The post-war period saw the Bell family's influence expand beyond Tennessee as railroad development and westward expansion created new opportunities. Countless Bell descendants appeared in frontier towns across the expanding nation, invariably establishing themselves as prominent citizens within remarkably short periods. They founded newspapers that shaped public opinion, banks that controlled local economies, and trading posts that became centers of regional commerce. Yet wherever Bell family members settled, certain patterns emerged. Local crime rates would initially drop as the Bell presence seemed to discourage disorder through means no one quite understood. However, missing persons reports would gradually increase, particularly involving transients and individuals without strong community ties. Local wildlife would begin avoiding areas around Bell properties, and domestic animals would display nervous behaviors when near Bell family members. The Bell descendants themselves seemed to age more slowly than their contemporaries, maintaining vitality and mental acuity well beyond normal human limits. Family portraits from the late 1800s show Bell family members who appeared decades younger than their recorded birth dates would suggest. More unsettling, these photographs often captured strange optical effects around Bell family members, shadows that fell at wrong angles, reflected light that seemed to emanate from their eyes, and background distortions that photographers could never adequately explain. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Bell family had evolved into something unprecedented in American supernatural history. They were no longer victims of a haunting, but had become the haunting itself, a bloodline that carried within it the essence of the entity that had once terrorized their ancestors. The Bell Witch had achieved a form of immortality through them, its consciousness distributed across dozens of descendants who carried forward its hunger and its power while appearing to be ordinary, if remarkably successful, American citizens. The original farmhouse in Adams County, Tennessee, remained in Bell family hands, though it was rarely occupied. It was death. Visitors to the property described feeling watched by invisible presences and hearing whispered conversations in rooms that appeared empty. Most chilling were the journals discovered in the farmhouse's hidden compartments during renovations in the 1890s. As Hand, they detailed the supernatural covenant he had negotiated and its effects on his family. The final entries, dated shortly before his death in 1860, revealed his growing horror at what he had unleashed upon future generations. "I believed I was saving my family," he wrote, "but I have instead cursed them to become the very evil that once threatened us." Each generation grows stronger in supernatural ability, but weaker in human compassion. They feed upon others as naturally as breathing, seeing ordinary people as resources to be harvested rather than fellow souls deserving of dignity and love. The Bell family's transformation from victims to predators represents one of the most complex supernatural legacies in American folklore. They had successfully negotiated with an entity of immense power, but in doing so had fundamentally altered their nature as human beings. The very abilities that allowed them to thrive and prosper also isolated them from normal human experience and morality. As the 19th century drew to a close, Bell family members could be found in positions of influence across the American landscape, their supernatural gifts allowing them to accumulate wealth and power that would have been impossible through conventional means. Yet they remained forever bound to the hunger that sustained them, forever marked by the covenant that had saved them from immediate destruction, but condemned them to become something far more dangerous than the entity they had originally feared. The Bell Witch had achieved a victory more complete than simple revenge. It had created a legacy that would perpetuate its influence across generations, ensuring that its hunger would never go unfed and its power would continue growing through the descendants of those it had once terrorized. As the Bell family's influence spread across America throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, their supernatural legacy began manifesting in ways that defied conventional understanding. What had begun as a simple haunting in rural Tennessee had evolved into something far more insidious, a bloodline that carried within it the very essence of the malevolent force they had once fought against. By the 1890s, Bell descendants had scattered across the expanding frontier, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to seek positions of power and influence. They gravitated toward mining operations, railroad construction, and territorial governance, always appearing at moments when communities faced their darkest hours. Their arrival invariably coincided with mysterious accidents, unexplained disappearances, and the kind of prosperity that came at a cost few could comprehend. In the Colorado Territory, Thomas Bell established what would become one of the most productive silver mines in the region. Local newspapers celebrated his success, but miners whispered of strange occurrences deep underground. Equipment would be found rearranged in impossible configurations, creating more efficient extraction methods that no engineer could explain. The mine's productivity soared, but it demanded a peculiar tribute, exactly one life lost every month during the new moon. Thomas possessed an unsettling ability to predict cave-ins and gas pockets with supernatural accuracy, often directing workers away from danger moments before disaster struck. Yet he seemed to know precisely when these accidents would claim their monthly victim, never intervening in those specific instances. His eyes, according to those who worked closely with him, reflected light in darkness, like those of a nocturnal predator, and his presence in the mine shafts caused temperatures to drop noticeably. The Bell gift, as family members had come to call their inherited abilities, manifested differently in each bloodline branch. Some developed an uncanny talent for reading people's deepest fears and desires, making them formidable negotiators and politicians. Others found themselves drawn to medicine, possessing diagnostic capabilities that bordered on prescient, though their patients often reported disturbing dreams after treatment. Martha Bell Patterson, who had settled in the Dakota Territory, became renowned for her midwifery skills. Every child she delivered survived, even in the most difficult circumstances, but these infants were invariably born with unusual characteristics. They rarely cried, their eyes tracked movement with adult-like focus, and they seemed to understand speech far earlier than natural development would allow. More troubling, these children exhibited an instinctive fear of churches and religious artifacts, often becoming violently ill when exposed to blessed objects. The family's supernatural nature became most evident during times of crisis. When the economic panic of 1893 devastated communities across the nation, Bell family enterprises not only survived, but thrived. They seemed to possess advanced knowledge of market fluctuations, always positioning themselves to benefit from others' misfortunes. Their success was so consistent that business rivals began to whisper of unnatural assistance. In San Francisco, Elizabeth Bell Morrison had established herself as one of the city's most successful real estate speculators. She purchased properties that others avoided, buildings with histories of suicide, murder, or unexplained phenomena. Under her ownership, these cursed locations transformed into highly desirable addresses, though tenants reported strange experiences. Voices echoed through empty rooms, shadows moved independently of their sources, and some residents claimed to see figures that weren't quite human wandering the hallways at night. Elizabeth herself aged remarkably slowly, maintaining the appearance of a woman in her 30s well into her 70s. She hosted elaborate dinner parties where guests left feeling simultaneously exhilarated and drained, as though some essential part of themselves had been consumed along with the meal. Several prominent businessmen who opposed her ventures died under mysterious circumstances, their bodies found in impossible locations, with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The Bell family's most disturbing evolution occurred in their relationship with death itself. Family members began demonstrating an ability to commune with the deceased, not through seances or spiritualist practices, but through a more direct and intimate connection. They could extract information from corpses, learning secrets that the living had taken to their graves. This gift proved invaluable in their business dealings, as they uncovered hidden assets, secret agreements, and buried scandals that gave them leverage over competitors. During the Spanish-American War, Captain James Bell served with distinction in the Philippines, earning commendations for his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements. Fellow officers noted his habit of walking battlefields after engagements, kneeling beside fallen soldiers, and whispering in a language none recognized. Those who witnessed these rituals reported that the captain seemed to absorb something from the corpses, emerging from each encounter with enhanced vigor and sharper tactical insight. The family's supernatural gifts came with increasingly severe psychological costs. Bell descendants suffered from chronic insomnia, plagued by dreams that weren't their own. They experienced the final moments of strangers, witnessed historical events they had never lived through, and received visitations from entities that existed in the spaces between life and death. Many developed an aversion to mirrors, claiming their reflections sometimes showed faces that weren't their own or revealed shadows of the original Bell Witch lurking behind them. Children born into the Bell bloodline displayed disturbing precocity, speaking fluently by their first birthday and demonstrating knowledge of family history spanning generations. They played games that involved elaborate rituals, arranging household objects in patterns that resembled the protective circles their ancestors had used against supernatural forces. The family's connection to the Bell Witch grew stronger with each generation rather than diminishing. Family reunions became elaborate ceremonies where members gathered to renew ancient pacts and share supernatural knowledge. These gatherings took place in remote locations, always during significant astronomical events, and involved rituals that combined elements of the original Tennessee haunting with practices learned from their interactions with other supernatural entities encountered during their westward expansion. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Bell family had evolved into something that transcended traditional concepts of both humanity and the supernatural. They existed as living bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, their very presence altering the fabric of reality around them. Communities touched by their influence never fully recovered, carrying within them a spiritual contamination that would manifest in subsequent generations through unexplained phenomena, increased rates of mental illness, and an inexplicable attraction to self-destructive behaviors. The Bell bloodline had become a supernatural dynasty, its members serving as unwitting agents of the malevolent force that had first terrorized their ancestors in Tennessee. They spread across America like a slow-acting poison, establishing themselves in positions of power and influence, while carrying with them the seeds of spiritual corruption that would continue to grow and spread long after their deaths. What had begun as a family's desperate bargain for survival had transformed into a curse that would echo through American history, touching countless lives and leaving behind a legacy of darkness that continues to influence events to this day. As the Bell family dynasty expanded its malevolent influence throughout the 19th century, something far more sinister began to emerge. The scattered bloodlines, each wielding their inherited supernatural abilities, started recognizing one another across the vast American landscape. What had begun as isolated family curses evolved into something resembling a dark confederation, bound not by choice, but by the inexorable pull of their shared origin. The first documented gathering occurred in 1851, deep within the Appalachian wilderness, where Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia converge. Local Cherokee legends speak of a place they called the Hollow of Whispers, where the boundary between worlds grew thin during certain lunar phases. It was here that representatives from 17 Bell-descended families convened, drawn by dreams that had haunted them simultaneously for months. Those who witnessed the gathering from afar described an otherworldly scene. Figures emerged from the mountain mists, each bearing the telltale signs of their inherited curse. Some moved with unnatural grace, their forms seeming to flicker between human and shadow. Others carried an aura of dread so potent that wildlife fled their presence for miles. The meeting lasted 3 nights, during which the assembled families discovered the true scope of their interconnected legacy. What they learned changed everything. The original entity that had struck the bargain with their ancestors was not merely some local spirit or demon. It was something far older, far more ambitious. Through careful manipulation spanning generations, it had orchestrated the spread of Bell descendants across America, positioning them in strategic locations like pieces on a vast chessboard. Each family's supernatural gifts were not random quirks of inherited power, but specialized tools designed for a greater purpose. The revelation came through shared visions that struck the gathered families simultaneously. They saw their ancestor, the original John Bell, not as a victim of supernatural harassment, but as a willing participant in an ancient covenant. The Bell Witch phenomena had been theater, a carefully constructed narrative to mask the true nature of what had transpired. John Bell had not been tormented to death by a vengeful spirit. He had been transformed, his consciousness absorbed into something larger, more enduring. The entity they served was revealed to be one of the first ones, beings that had existed before human civilization, before recorded history. These entities had once walked freely upon the earth, but had been forced into hiding as humanity's numbers grew and their collective belief systems created barriers against the old powers. The first one that claimed the Bell family understood that direct confrontation with humanity's expanding influence would fail. Instead, it chose infiltration, corruption from within. Through the Bell bloodline, it could work through human agents who appeared normal, who could rise to positions of influence and power without detection. Each family's abilities were designed to serve specific functions in this grand design. Those who could influence minds and emotions would enter politics and media. Those who could predict future events would dominate financial markets. Those who could commune with the dead would control information networks that spanned both the living and departed. The 1851 gathering established what became known as the Concord, a loose alliance of Bell-descended families bound by their shared servitude to the first one. Unlike traditional conspiracies driven by human ambition, the Concord operated under supernatural compulsion. Family members found themselves unable to truly oppose the network's goals, their inherited abilities turning against them if they attempted rebellion. The Concord's influence grew exponentially as America itself expanded westward. Bell descendants were among the first settlers in California during the gold rush, not seeking fortune, but establishing footholds for their patron entity. They were present during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, ensuring certain routes passed through locations of supernatural significance. They infiltrated the burgeoning industrial empires of the Gilded Age, their precognitive abilities allowing them to anticipate market movements and technological innovations. By 1875, the network had evolved beyond mere coordination. The families discovered they could share their abilities temporarily through ritual blood exchanges performed during specific astronomical alignments. A Bell descendant gifted with influence over human emotions could transfer portions of that power to a relative blessed with prophetic sight, creating hybrid abilities that were even more potent than their original gifts. These power sharing rituals came with a terrible cost. Each exchange required a sacrifice, typically a non Bell family member who had grown too close to discovering the truth. The victim's life force would fuel the transfer, their consciousness becoming trapped within the shared supernatural matrix that connected all Bell descendants. Over time, the Concord accumulated thousands of these imprisoned souls, creating a vast psychic reservoir that amplified their collective abilities. The trapped souls served another purpose. They became an early warning system, their dispersed consciousness able to detect threats to the Concord from across great distances. Government investigators who grew too curious about patterns in political appointments or business dealings would find themselves plagued by nightmares, accidents, and mysterious illnesses. Journalists attempting to expose corruption would discover their sources vanishing, their evidence destroyed by seemingly natural disasters. The network's most audacious achievement came during the Civil War. Bell descendants had positioned themselves on both sides of the conflict, not to determine the outcome, but to ensure maximum carnage. The first one fed on suffering and death, growing stronger with each battlefield massacre. Bell family members served as officers, suppliers, and even generals, prolonging the conflict through strategic incompetence and manufactured crises. The war's aftermath provided perfect cover for the Concord's expansion. In the chaos of Reconstruction, Bell descendants acquired vast tracts of land, established banks and shipping companies, and embedded themselves within the emerging federal bureaucracy. They were instrumental in the Indian Wars that followed, not driven by racism or territorial ambition, but by their patrons' hunger for the spiritual energy released by cultural destruction. Native American tribes had long recognized the threat posed by the Bell bloodline. Cherokee shamans spoke of the sickness that walks like men, describing individuals who appeared human but carried within them a spiritual contagion that corrupted everything they touched. Several tribes attempted to form alliances specifically to combat the Bell descendants, but their efforts were systematically undermined by supernatural manipulation and strategic betrayals orchestrated through the Concord's influence networks. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Bell family legacy had become something unprecedented in human history. What had begun as a single family's supernatural affliction had evolved into a shadow civilization operating within American society. They controlled banks that financed industrial expansion, newspapers that shaped public opinion, and political machines that determined electoral outcomes. Their influence extended into religious organizations, educational institutions, and even emerging scientific communities. The first one's patience was finally bearing fruit. Through careful breeding programs disguised as arranged marriages within high society, the Bell bloodline was being concentrated and purified. Children born of these unions possessed abilities that dwarfed those of their ancestors, capable of reshaping reality itself through focused will. These new generations were being prepared for something momentous, a grand working that would tear down the barriers between worlds and restore the first ones to their ancient dominion over Earth. Yet the network's very success contained the seeds of its own vulnerabilities. The supernatural abilities that bound the families together also created psychic resonances that sensitive individuals could detect. A growing number of people across America began experiencing prophetic dreams, warning of a great darkness spreading through the nation's power structures. Religious leaders spoke of an approaching spiritual war. Occultists and mystics found their divination tools consistently pointing toward a specific bloodline as a source of metaphysical contamination. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just America's future, but the fate of human consciousness itself. The Bell family's dark covenant, nurtured across generations of careful manipulation, was approaching its ultimate fulfillment. The first ones had waited millennia for this moment. By 1923, their patient cultivation of the Bell bloodline was approaching its final phase. The ancient entity that had first terrorized the Bell family in 1817 was merely one fragment of a collective consciousness that spanned continents and centuries. Now, as the Bell descendants spread across America like a supernatural plague, the true scope of their apocalyptic purpose became horrifyingly clear. The Great Convergence, as the family's most enlightened members called it, was not some distant prophecy, but an imminent reality. Every political alliance, every strategic marriage, every child born with the mark had been building toward this singular moment when the barriers between dimensions would finally collapse. The Bell dynasty had become something far more dangerous than a cursed bloodline. They had evolved into the earthly anchor points for entities whose very existence threatened the fabric of human consciousness itself. What the family had discovered in their deepest archives would have driven ordinary minds to madness. The Bell Witch had never been a ghost, a demon, or even a singular entity. It was a reconnaissance probe, a spiritual tendril extending from something so vast and alien that human language possessed no adequate terms to describe it. The first ones existed in a realm where thought became reality, where emotion could reshape matter, and where the distinction between individual consciousness and collective will had long since dissolved. The Bell family's rapid expansion across America during the early 20th century followed patterns that defied natural explanation. Their members appeared in key positions at moments of national crisis, always offering solutions that seemed miraculous, but carried hidden costs. During the Great Depression, Bell family members emerged as financial advisors whose investment strategies saved countless fortunes while secretly funneling resources into a network of facilities hidden throughout the American wilderness. These installations, disguised as everything from mining operations to agricultural research centers, served a single purpose: the construction of what the family's inner circle termed the resonance grid. Each facility contained chambers lined with materials that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, neither fully matter nor energy. Within these spaces, specially trained Bell descendants performed rituals that gradually weakened the dimensional barriers separating our reality from the realm of the first ones. The process required precise timing and absolute coordination. Every facility had to activate simultaneously during specific astronomical alignments that occurred only once every few centuries. The family had been preparing for this moment since their first encounter with the entity in 1817, each generation adding new sites to the grid, each birth producing children with enhanced psychic sensitivity necessary to maintain the delicate connections between worlds. By 1935, the grid encompassed 47 facilities spread across 32 states. Bell family members had infiltrated the highest levels of government, finance, and military command. Their influence extended far beyond what any single family should have been able to achieve. But then again, they were no longer entirely human. Each generation had sacrificed more of their humanity in exchange for power, becoming conduits for intelligences that viewed human consciousness as little more than a temporary obstacle to overcome. The signs of their transformation were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Bell family members aged differently, their lifespans extending far beyond normal human limits, while their emotional responses became increasingly mechanical. They spoke in perfect unison when discussing family business, as though accessing shared memories from a collective source. Most disturbing of all, they began displaying knowledge of events that had not yet occurred, suggesting their consciousness had somehow become unstuck from linear time. The family's breeding program, which had initially seemed like nothing more than strategic marriage alliances, revealed its true purpose as the convergence approached. Every union had been carefully planned to produce children with specific psychic frequencies, each generation fine-tuning their spiritual resonance to match the vibrational patterns of the first ones. The children born in the 1930s and 1940s represented the culmination of over a century of genetic and spiritual manipulation, human-alien hybrids capable of serving as perfect vessels for entities that existed beyond physical form. These hybrid children exhibited abilities that transcended conventional understanding of psychic phenomena. They could communicate telepathically across vast distances, manipulate probability through focused intention, and most terrifyingly, temporarily phase in and out of physical reality. Government agencies that encountered them during routine investigations found their reports mysteriously classified or entirely erased from official records, as though the children possessed the ability to edit reality itself. The family's influence extended into realms most people never considered. Bell descendants had infiltrated religious organizations, establishing cults that worshipped the coming convergence while disguising their true purpose as Christian revival movements. They had penetrated academic institutions, subtly influencing scientific research toward discoveries that would make humanity more receptive to alien consciousness. They had even embedded themselves within entertainment industries, using films, radio programs, and literature to gradually acclimate the public to concepts that would otherwise have been rejected as impossible. Perhaps most insidiously, they had begun affecting human dreams on a mass scale. Millions of Americans reported similar nightmares during the 1930s and 1940s, visions of vast intelligences pressing against the boundaries of reality, of shadows moving independently of their sources, of familiar faces speaking in languages that predated human civilization. These dreams were not random psychological phenomena, but deliberate psychological conditioning, preparing human minds for the moment when the first ones would finally breach the dimensional barriers that had contained them for eons. The Bell family's transformation had accelerated dramatically as the convergence approached. By 1940, the oldest members had become something that could barely be described as human. Their bodies remained recognizably mammalian, but their consciousness had merged so completely with alien intelligence that they functioned more as organic communication devices than independent entities. They spoke of human emotions as quaint evolutionary artifacts of individual identity, as a primitive concept that would soon become obsolete. Their younger members, those born after 1920, represented something entirely new in human history. They possessed human appearance and could mimic human behavior with perfect accuracy, but their fundamental nature was alien. They experienced reality as a fluid construct that could be manipulated through will and intention. They perceived time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression. Most disturbing of all, they regarded unmodified humans with the same detached curiosity that entomologists might show toward insects, fascinating specimens worthy of study, but ultimately inferior forms of consciousness. The family's preparations for the Great Convergence involved more than just dimensional manipulation and genetic engineering. They had spent decades establishing what they called contingency protocols, backup plans designed to ensure their success, even if their primary strategy encountered unexpected obstacles. These protocols included the strategic placement of hybrid children in adoptive families throughout America, creating sleeper agents who would remain dormant until activated by specific psychic triggers. They had also established what they termed the preservation archives, hidden repositories containing the complete genetic and psychological profiles of thousands of ordinary humans. These archives served a dual purpose. They provided templates for creating more convincing human disguises, and they preserved samples of unmodified humanity for future study after the convergence transformed the species beyond recognition. The family's financial empire, built through supernatural insight and otherworldly assistance, had grown to encompass major holdings in every significant American industry. They controlled banks that funded infrastructure projects, manufacturing companies that produced materials for their hidden facilities, and transportation networks that allowed them to move personnel and equipment without detection. Their wealth was not merely a tool for achieving their goals, but a weapon for destabilizing human civilization at the moment of convergence. As 1943 approached, the astronomical conditions necessary for the Great Convergence began aligning for the first time in over 6 centuries. The family's psychic descendants reported increasingly vivid contact with the first ones, receiving detailed instructions for the final phase of their century-long preparation. The entities had grown impatient after their long exile, and their influence was beginning to leak through the weakened dimensional barriers, even before the convergence itself. The effects of this premature contact were becoming visible to those who knew what to observe. Electronics malfunctioned in predictable patterns around Bell family members. Animals displayed unusual behavior in their presence, either fleeing in terror or becoming unnaturally docile. Most significantly, ordinary humans began experiencing spontaneous psychic phenomena after extended exposure to family members, suggesting that the alien influence was beginning to spread beyond its intended carriers. The family's leadership recognized that they were approaching a point of no return. The convergence would either succeed completely, transforming human consciousness and allowing the first ones to establish permanent residence in our reality, or it would fail catastrophically, potentially destroying both the Bell bloodline and their alien masters. There was no middle ground, no possibility of partial success. Everything they had worked toward for over a century would be decided in a matter of hours during the final convergence ritual. The weight of this cosmic responsibility had transformed even the family's newest members into something barely recognizable as human. They moved through the world like actors playing roles they had memorized but never truly understood, their alien consciousness struggling to maintain the pretense of human emotion and motivation. Their success had come at the cost of everything that made them recognizably part of the human species, and as the convergence approached, even that pretense was beginning to crumble. The Bell family had become the vanguard of an invasion that would make every previous conquest in human history seem trivial by comparison. They were no longer the victims of a supernatural haunting, but the willing architects of humanity's transformation into something unrecognizably alien. The entity that had first appeared in their Tennessee cabin had been merely the first contact in a campaign of spiritual conquest that spanned centuries and continents. The Great Convergence was no longer a distant threat, but an imminent reality that would reshape human consciousness itself. The Bell family had spent over a century preparing for this moment, transforming themselves from ordinary farmers into hybrid beings capable of serving as conduits for intelligences that viewed human individuality as a temporary obstacle to overcome. The year 1924 marked a turning point that few historians dare acknowledge. While America celebrated the Roaring Twenties, deep within the Appalachian Mountains, Bell descendants were orchestrating something far more sinister than their ancestors could have ever imagined. What began as scattered family branches hiding their supernatural heritage had evolved into a coordinated network of influence that stretched from the backwoods of Tennessee to the marble halls of Washington, D.C. The Great Convergence was no longer a distant threat whispered about in family letters. It was becoming reality, one carefully orchestrated step at a time. The Bell bloodline had learned to weaponize their inherited abilities, transforming from victims of supernatural circumstance into willing architects of cosmic horror. By this time, Bell descendants occupied positions that would have seemed impossible for a cursed mountain family just decades earlier. Senator Marcus Bell of Virginia sat on the Committee for Interstate Commerce, using his position to facilitate the construction of railways that followed specific geometric patterns across the eastern seaboard. These weren't random infrastructure projects. Each rail line corresponded to ley lines that Bell family occultists had mapped using abilities inherited from their otherworldly covenant. The tracks formed a massive sigil stretching across multiple states, a terrestrial anchor point designed to stabilize dimensional barriers, not to strengthen them, but to control exactly where and when they would collapse. Every train that traveled these routes carried passengers unknowingly through a network of supernatural influence, their collective human consciousness gradually attuned to frequencies that would make the coming transition easier. In the industrial centers of Pittsburgh and Detroit, Bell descendants had infiltrated the burgeoning steel and automotive industries. Their supernatural intuition gave them uncanny abilities to predict market fluctuations and technological innovations. But more importantly, they ensured that specific materials were incorporated into mass-produced goods. Steel alloys contained trace elements harvested from meteorites that had fallen near the original Bell farm. Automotive paint included pigments derived from minerals found only in caves where the family had conducted their darkest rituals. These weren't random contaminations. Every Bell descendant carried genetic markers that resonated with these materials. As their products spread across America, they created a vast network of sympathetic connections. A Bell descendant in Chicago could sense the emotional state of someone driving a Ford in California. A family member in New York could influence the dreams of a steelworker in Pennsylvania simply by touching a beam that had been forged with their specially treated alloys. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what family documents referred to as the breeding program. Unlike their ancestors, who had simply accepted whatever supernatural changes occurred in their bloodline, these descendants actively sought to enhance and direct their evolution. They had discovered that certain combinations of Bell genetics produced offspring with dramatically amplified abilities. Dr. Helena Bell Morrison established a private medical practice in Richmond that served as a front for genetic experimentation that wouldn't be understood by mainstream science for another century. Using knowledge that seemed to come from sources beyond human understanding, she mapped hereditary patterns in the Bell bloodline and began arranging marriages designed to concentrate specific supernatural traits. Children born from these unions displayed abilities that terrified even their own families. Some could perceive events occurring hundreds of miles away. Others could influence the thoughts and dreams of multiple people simultaneously. The most powerful could temporarily phase between dimensions, vanishing from one location and appearing in another with no memory of the journey between. But these enhanced abilities came with a terrible cost. The children aged rapidly, their bodies unable to sustain the supernatural energies coursing through them. Most died before their 20th birthday, but not before producing detailed journals describing visions of the first ones and the coming transformation of human consciousness. These writings became sacred texts for the family, providing increasingly specific instructions for preparing Earth for dimensional convergence. The stock market crash of 1929 provided the perfect cover for the Bell Network's most ambitious operation yet. While the rest of America struggled with economic collapse, Bell descendants used their supernatural abilities to predict and profit from market fluctuations. But wealth accumulation was merely a means to an end. They established the Appalachian Research Foundation, ostensibly a charitable organization dedicated to preserving mountain culture and providing education to isolated communities. In reality, it was a network of facilities where the most promising Bell children were taken for specialized training. These weren't schools in any conventional sense. They were laboratories where young minds were systematically broken down and rebuilt to serve as conduits for otherworldly influence. The curriculum included meditation techniques that opened students' consciousness to alien thought patterns, mathematical systems based on non-Euclidean geometry that described the structure of parallel dimensions, and ritual practices that gradually severed their connection to normal human reality. Graduates emerged as perfect vessels, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective consciousness that served the will of the first ones. By the 1940s, this network had produced what family documents called the awakened generation. These individuals appeared completely normal to outside observers, but internally they were something else entirely. They could function in human society while simultaneously existing partially in the realm of the first ones. They felt no loyalty to humanity, no connection to human values or emotions. They were advanced scouts for an invasion that would reshape reality itself. These awakened descendants infiltrated every level of American society. They became teachers who subtly influenced young minds, politicians who shaped policy to serve hidden agendas, and scientists who directed research toward discoveries that would accelerate dimensional convergence. Their supernatural abilities allowed them to identify and recruit others who showed potential for similar transformation, gradually expanding their network beyond the original Bell bloodline. The development of nuclear weapons presented an unprecedented opportunity. Several Bell descendants worked on the Manhattan Project, not as scientists, but in support roles that gave them access to materials and information. They weren't interested in the bombs themselves, but in the exotic isotopes and energy signatures produced by nuclear reactions. These materials resonated with the same frequencies that had first allowed the Bell Witch to breach dimensional barriers. By incorporating radioactive elements into their rituals, the descendants could amplify their abilities exponentially. More importantly, they discovered that nuclear detonations created temporary rifts in space-time that could be exploited for communication with the first ones. The atomic tests in Nevada weren't just weapons demonstrations. They were experiments in controlled dimensional manipulation conducted under the observation of Bell descendants who used the nuclear fireballs as beacons to guide otherworldly entities toward Earth. Each explosion weakened the barriers between dimensions, creating permanent anchor points that would facilitate the eventual convergence. As the 1950s dawned, the Bell Network faced a new challenge. The rise of mass media and improved communication threatened to expose their activities to public scrutiny. Government agencies were becoming more sophisticated in their monitoring capabilities. The isolation that had protected mountain families for generations was rapidly disappearing. Their response was characteristically cunning. Instead of retreating deeper into hiding, they moved into the light. Bell descendants became prominent figures in the emerging television industry, using their supernatural charisma to influence audiences on a massive scale. They produced programs that appeared to be harmless entertainment, but contained subliminal elements designed to make viewers more susceptible to otherworldly influence. Children's shows were particularly effective vehicles for this manipulation. Young minds, still developing their understanding of reality, could be subtly programmed to accept concepts that would prepare them for the coming transformation. Cartoons contained geometric patterns that trained developing brains to perceive non-Euclidean space. Educational programs included mathematical concepts that would later serve as mental frameworks for understanding multidimensional reality. The Cold War provided perfect cover for the network's expansion into international operations. Bell descendants joined intelligence agencies, using their supernatural abilities to gather information that conventional espionage methods couldn't obtain. But their true mission wasn't serving American interests. They were mapping global consciousness patterns, identifying populations that would be most receptive to the influence of the first ones. They discovered that certain geographical locations around the world contained natural dimensional weak points similar to the original Bell Farm. Ancient sites that primitive cultures had considered sacred or forbidden often marked places where the boundaries between worlds were naturally thin. The network began acquiring these properties through shell companies and government connections, establishing facilities that served as anchor points for an emerging global grid. By the early 1960s, the Bell descendants had achieved something their ancestors could never have imagined. They had transformed from a cursed family into the secret architects of humanity's future. The supernatural entity that had once tormented them was now their willing partner in reshaping reality itself. The Great Convergence was no longer a distant threat. It was an approaching inevitability, orchestrated by human agents who had surrendered their humanity in exchange for power beyond imagination. Every technological advancement, every social movement, every political development was subtly guided to serve the ultimate goal of preparing Earth for dimensional merger. The original Bell family had made a bargain with forces beyond their understanding to escape supernatural persecution. Their descendants had transformed that bargain into a blueprint for the systematic colonization of human consciousness. The witch that had once haunted a Tennessee farmhouse had evolved into something far more dangerous, a network of human agents working to deliver their entire species to alien masters. The stage was set for the final phase of a plan that had been centuries in the making. The barriers between worlds were weakening. The anchor points were in place. The human agents were positioned throughout every level of society. All that remained was the signal that would begin humanity's transformation into something unrecognizably other. As the convergence approaches its final phase, we must confront the terrifying truth about what the Bell family conspiracy has truly accomplished. Their centuries-long manipulation has fundamentally altered the fabric of reality itself, creating conditions that will soon make their cosmic reunion inevitable. The resonance grids they've constructed across North America have begun operating at full capacity. These aren't merely technological installations, but living amalgamations of advanced science and ancient supernatural forces. Each grid point pulses with energy drawn from ley lines, nuclear facilities, and the collective psychic emanations of millions of unsuspecting humans. The grids communicate with each other through frequencies that bypass conventional physics, creating a continental network that functions as a massive dimensional doorway. Recent satellite imagery has captured disturbing anomalies around these sites. Geometric patterns appear in crop fields, visible only from high altitude, forming symbols that mirror those found in the oldest Bell family archives. Weather systems behave erratically near grid locations, with storms forming perfect spirals and dissipating without warning. Most unsettling are the temporal distortions. Clocks run backward for minutes at a time. Wildlife avoids these areas entirely, as though some primal instinct warns them of impending catastrophe. The Bell descendants themselves have begun their final transformation. No longer content to work behind the scenes, they've started revealing themselves openly to those they deem worthy of recruitment or elimination. Their physical forms have evolved beyond human limitations. Witnesses describe figures that seem to shift between dimensions, present, but somehow not entirely there. Their eyes reflect light in ways that suggest they're seeing wavelengths beyond human perception. When they speak, their voices carry harmonics that resonate directly in listeners' bones, conveying meaning through vibration rather than words. These evolved bells possess abilities that defy rational explanation. They can step through solid matter as though it were mist. They appear simultaneously in multiple locations, suggesting they've learned to exist across parallel dimensions. Most terrifying is their ability to influence reality through will alone. Objects move without being touched. Electronics malfunction in their presence, displaying impossible readouts and transmitting signals to unknown receivers. Photographs taken of them reveal distortions in the background, as though their very existence warps space-time. The families that have served the bells for generations are experiencing their own metamorphosis. Children born to these bloodlines now exhibit supernatural abilities from birth. They speak in languages that predate human civilization. They draw complex mathematical equations despite having no formal education. Their artwork depicts scenes from other worlds, other realities that they claim to visit in their dreams. Medical examinations reveal physiological changes that suggest adaptation to environments that don't exist on Earth. Government agencies that once monitored the Bell conspiracy have either been compromised or destroyed. Key officials have vanished without explanation. Files have been corrupted by digital anomalies that seem to possess their own intelligence. Military installations near grid sites report equipment failures that follow no known pattern of malfunction. Communications systems transmit messages in code that defies all attempts at decryption, suggesting contact with entities operating according to entirely different logical frameworks. The convergence has begun manifesting in ways that make denial impossible. Across the continent, people report shared dreams of vast cities suspended in darkness, populated by beings whose forms suggest intelligence evolved along completely alien lines. These aren't nightmares, but invitations, glimpses of the reality that awaits once the dimensional barriers collapse completely. Those who experience these visions describe feeling simultaneously terrified and drawn to the cosmic immensity they witness. Reality itself has become unstable around the grid sites. Witnesses report seeing multiple versions of the same location existing simultaneously, like photographs printed on transparent film and overlapped. The laws of physics operate inconsistently. Water flows upward. Shadows fall toward light sources instead of away from them. Time moves at different rates within small geographical areas, creating pockets where minutes stretch into hours or collapse into seconds. The Bell family's media networks have begun broadcasting the final phase of their psychological conditioning program. News reports contain subliminal messages that prepare viewers for the coming transformation. Entertainment programs feature themes of dimensional travel and cosmic evolution with increasing frequency. Social media algorithms push content that normalizes the supernatural and conditions users to accept reality shifts as natural phenomena. Most disturbing are the recruitment drives now occurring in plain sight. The Bells and their allies approach individuals with specific genetic markers, bloodlines that trace back to their original supernatural contacts. These people report feeling compelled to travel to remote locations where they undergo processes that fundamentally alter their consciousness. They return as something other than human, retaining their memories and personalities, but serving purposes they cannot fully comprehend. The convergence will complete when the dimensional barriers weaken sufficiently to allow the first ones direct access to our reality. When this occurs, the distinction between dimensions will collapse entirely. The ancient entities that have manipulated human civilization through the Bell family will manifest physically, bringing with them technologies and consciousness structures that will reshape human existence beyond recognition. This isn't merely an invasion, but a transformation of reality itself into something that can sustain beings whose existence operates according to cosmic principles incomprehensible to human minds. The Bell family, having served faithfully for centuries, will be rewarded with elevation to a higher form of existence. The rest of humanity will face a choice: adapt to the new reality or be absorbed into the collective consciousness of the first ones. The signs are accelerating. The convergence approaches, and the sinister legacy of the Bell family, begun with a simple haunting in 1817, will soon reshape the entire universe into something unrecognizably alien. Their macabre history was never just about one cursed family. It was always about preparing humanity for its ultimate transformation into something that serves cosmic masters who view human consciousness as merely raw material for their incomprehensible designs. The Bell Witch was just the beginning. What comes next will determine whether humanity survives as a species or becomes something else entirely.